Okay, good morning to you all. It is Tuesday and it is September 29th, and this lecture will be the second of chapter 3. So it should be 3A. The first one was 3 and this should be 3A. And we are continuing the cognitive development, building a foundation for language. Okay? Before we get started, uh, for those of you who may not know, I did put on Canvas a study guide for chapter 2. And I've used this as a pop quiz in other classes, but those classes were always face-to-face. And circumstances are certainly a little bit different with you guys because of being online and the pandemic and all of that. So I'm just giving it to you online as a study guide. It has to be filled out and turned in to me by Monday, October the 5th, by the end of the day, for 5 points extra credit. I will not be able to accept the study guide filled out after that date. So I did want to give you that. Also, when I was lecturing yesterday in class, I did show the class 3 YouTube videos. Examples of cooing, examples of babbling, and an example of twin babies talking. So I do want you to Google YouTube examples of cooing, YouTube examples of babbling, and then within those videos, as you see them on the right side of your screen, you will see the one about talking twin babies part 2. Talking twin babies part 2, okay? Now the cooing video is baby makes cute cooing noises, and it's a compilation. It's compiled of, I don't know, maybe several different instances of the baby cooing. Baby makes cute cooing noises. It's a compilation. The one on babbling that I liked, that I feel gives you a good example, is 7 months babbling. 7 months babbling. Okay? So those are the 3 videos. They are not going to be put on, the link will not be on Canvas. You have to Google YouTube video examples of cooing and babbling. And then with those other additional videos on the right side of the screen, you will find Talking Twin Babies Part 2. And what I want you to pay a particular attention to is the difference between cooing and babbling. And we're going to talk about cooing and babbling this morning. Okay. I believe that I've stopped with Piaget's 4 stages of intellectual development. And those 4 stages are sensory motor intelligence, pre-operational thought, concrete operations, and formal operations. Those are the 4 stages within that sensory motor category that takes us into development. Now, sensory motor intelligence, as Piaget describes it, is from birth to 2. Now, from birth to 2, language blows up. Language literally explodes. Babies are reflexive, Infants are reflexive, and they're pretty motoric because they're reflexive when they cry because they're hungry, they're wet, they're not feeling well. Maybe they just want to be repositioned. Well, they can't move all that much except when they're crying, they're flailing, their arms maybe, and their legs might be kicking a little bit, but they're not able to change their own diaper. They're not able to get something to eat or drink, and they're not really able to maybe move in a way that's more comfortable. So they're very, very reflexive and motor oriented. The biggest thing that we see in sensory motor development or intelligence is the cognitive development occurs rapidly. And that's a very important part of sensory motor intelligence. Now remember, I've told you in the past, if I have something marked as the most important, the best, the most significant, that's something that is important for you to remember and to study for and know for an exam, because that potentially will be on an exam. Now, there is a big difference between that infant that's newborn or a week old and that infant that is now a 2-year-old toddler. That 2-year time period is extremely important. And as I just said, for cognitive development, because it's very rapid. Now, there's not such a big difference between a person who's 20 and a person who's 22. You're already through all of those stages of development and developmental intelligence. But when you talk about an infant or a toddler, a few months is a very big difference. So this is an important stage for cognitive intelligence and cognitive development. Pre-operational thought is the second one. This is from 2 years to 7 years. And this is the most rapid stage of language development. Now we begin to see, as I just said, that explosion in language. It's really beginning to pick up at the age of 2 because our kiddos are now beginning to put phrases together. And once they can string words together, there's no stopping them. They are able to tell you more about how they feel, what they want, what they need, and most importantly, you're responding to that. You're maybe imitating what they've just said. Maybe the child says, want cookie, 2-word phrase, and you're saying, oh, wow, good talking. You want a cookie. I want a cookie. Let's get that cookie. Look at how much language that I generated to give back to that child with just the phrase, want cookie. So as we begin to get into that pre-operational thought, most rapid stage of language development, and it's between 2 and 7. As we get closer to that 7 years, because 2 years to 7 years is a huge span, they're beginning to think in concepts, they're looking at categories, they're solving some problems, especially problems that allow them to get something that they want. That's always a good thing. How can I get what I want? That concept, that means end. I want to get that cookie, and how can I get that cookie? And the ways that they can do that are very creative. The third stage is concrete operations. This is from 7 to 11 years. And they're beginning to think logically. The fourth stage is formal operations. That's 11 years to 15 years. And the cognitive development, as you may see on your PowerPoint, is fully developed. Now, that doesn't mean that we still don't add to that cognitive development, but we've reached full development that we will add to as time goes on. Those kiddos are able to think more abstractly to solve problems, and they're using more mental problem solving. They're a little more analytical in their thinking too, and they can reason and think very logically. So those are Piaget's 4 stages of intellectual development, and we're going to get more in depth into some of their stages too. Each child, according to Piaget, goes through all of the stages. And Piaget says you can't not go through those stages. You have to go through those stages in a logical sequence, and that you should not skip a stage of development. Now, I've had parents tell me, as I question them to fill out the case history, I'll ask about the developmental milestone of sitting at 6 months. I'll ask maybe about crawling. Did they crawl at 8 months? I'll ask about their first word around a year. I'll ask about when they started walking, which is also around 12 months. Now, sometimes parents will tell me, you know, he never crawled. All he did was he sat, and then all of a sudden one day he started walking. I don't know if they did or if they didn't, but I'll tell you, I'm not going to challenge that parent. I'm not going to say that didn't happen because I don't know, but I suspect that the child did do some crawling, and maybe that crawling stage, they weren't in that crawling stage for very long. And they began crawling. They crawled over to the sofa. They pulled themselves to stand. They started cruising along the furniture, and then they took off. And maybe that crawling stage was brief. Also, if a parent tells me he didn't say a word until he was 3 years old, then he started talking in sentences. Well, that is one of those moments that I call, It's a moment, because we are wired to produce sound at a very young age, and to produce syllables, to produce words, to put words together, to make sentences. We're wired that way. So if I hear that, I think, maybe the child was unintelligible. Maybe they couldn't hear those words clearly, and so they didn't pick up on the word approximation. Or they thought the word had to be perfect before it was considered a word, which isn't true. If the child said "ooey" for cookie and it was consistent, that's cookie. That's a word. So sometimes it's that person's interpretation, but I certainly won't challenge that. But Piaget says they have to go through all of these stages. One stage is dependent upon the other. You build on skills. The baby is on its back a lot. Then the baby rolls. Then the baby is able to get to a sitting position. Then the baby sits independently. Then the baby begins to crawl, or commando crawl. Their crawling sometimes is pretty humorous. Then they get to the sofa or the chair. They pull to stand. They cruise, and then they walk independently. They start out by cooing. They babble. We have reduplicated babbling, and I'll talk about that. We get to variegated babbling. We get to jargon. We get to true words, phrases, and sentences. And so we know that one skill builds on another. And think about it. The child is flat on their back, so what they're watching is this thing above them that maybe goes in a circle, that mobile, and remember, they can see between 7.5 and 8 inches, which that's why we have mobiles and toys that you put them on the floor on their back, and you have this little miniature swing set. You have things that rattle and things that move and a mirror and things that reflect. Well, they have something to talk about now, something to be interested in, something to watch, different shapes, different sounds, different colors. So it's that stage, those stages that take us to where we are today. We all went through those stages. Stage one, some things that we're talking about, and that's the sensory motor intelligence. Okay. This stage is preparing children for more expressive language, for more speech, for more language development, because we've got the senses. We're talking about touch, we're talking about smell, vision, we're talking about taste. Things go in their mouth. That's how they're learning about something that feels cold, something that's bumpy, something that's smooth, something that's round, something that's hard or squishy. And at this point, when they begin to crawl, you have to watch them so carefully, because they will find every little thing on the floor and it will go in their mouth. So what if you have an ant trap out? Well, it's poison. What if you have dropped little beads on the floor? They'll pick it up and put it in their mouth. They have no sense of danger in what may happen. What if you've dropped one of your pills? You dropped a sharp object. Many years ago, I took x-rays. I was an x-ray technician. And for a group of orthopedic surgeons, one of the orthopods brought their child in for me to x-ray, because the child, he thought, had swallowed a dime. So I took the x-ray, and sure enough, there it was. We could see it. You have to be so careful. You have to make your home environment so very safe, because they will put everything in their mouth. The acquisition of language is very complex, and it depends on so many different factors that are related to cognition. And we're going to add a new one, perception. We're going to add perception to that. Now, you've heard me say you cannot separate language from cognition totally. They do run parallel. Cognition is language, language is cognition, and they do intertwine for sure. But now we're going to add perception. What in the world is perception? Well, perception is and it's on your PowerPoint, is the process by which we select, organize, integrate, and interpret sensory stimuli. So an example of that is you hear the doorbell ring. Well, you've heard that doorbell ring before. And you've heard the timer go off on the oven. And you know what that sounds like. So and you've had that experience. So your perception of ding dong or ding or whatever it sounds like, oh, that's the door. I know that because I've selected the sound, I've organized that sound, and I've integrated it. And it's in my brain. And I know that's the doorbell, and it is not the timer on the oven. You have perceived the sound and what it is. So how do you separate that from cognition? Well, you can't. Cognition and perception are like cognition and language. They're all intertwined. They're all intertwined, and they're all very important. Distancing is the distance between the child and contact with an actual object. When children are first exploring objects, they uh, they pick it up, and maybe it's it's a block, not a small block that they're going to potentially swallow, but it's big enough, and so it goes into their mouth, and they're exploring it with their tongue, and you have lots and lots and lots of sensory nerve fibers in your mouth. And so they're exploring it that way, and they know that after several times of doing that, it's a block. Well, after a while, they know, they've learned that's a block. And so the child doesn't have to have contact with that block in their mouth all the time because they've already identified that as a block. Distancing, the distance between the child and contact with the actual object becomes greater. That distancing, they've learned what it is, they know what it is, and so they don't have to have that object to explore anymore. They relate to their environment in a very physical way. Flat on their back, rolling, pulling up to sit. They may wobble. They may sort of sit with their legs open and their hands on the floor, and they're leaning on their hands. Well, your world looks very different from that position. And then all of a sudden, you gained some good strength in your core, and you're able to sit up all the way. And your hands are more free, and you're able to reach and put your hands together and touch your toes while in a seated position. And then pretty soon, before you know it, you're on your belly, and you look like you're swimming because you can't make it all work, because you want to crawl and you can't make it all work. And you become very, very physical. It's very motoric. Language is the ultimate distance. Block, I don't even have to see it. I know what it is. I can see big blocks, little blocks, red blocks, green blocks, Lego blocks, any kind of block. That's my language. That's my language developing. And so language is the ultimate distance. We're wanting to take information that we're learning about and put it in your brain. Put it someplace in that brain to store it. The ability to use words in place of things is called representation. Object permanence is related to sensory motor. It's a concept, and I think you all know what object permanence is. It's out of sight, out of mind. You know that objects exist. And it's a skill that develops along the way. And you know that I really like this thing, but it gets covered up and I no longer see it, so it's no longer within my world. And then as you continue to explore, object permanence is no longer a problem. And that skill, let's see, I wanted to make sure I gave you the right information. Fully developed concept of object permanence is 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24 months. Another concept in sensory motor is causality. You know that one thing causes another. Means end is how can I get it, and I'm able to. It's an extension of causality. So the concept of object permanence, causality, and means end. I can figure out if I take this chair and I move it over to the counter, I can get to the cookies. Now sometimes, and that's not a bad thing, but you don't want a knife to be on the counter. You don't want a pair of scissors to be on the counter. Um, you don't want the child to have an object in their hand and take it over to the outlet, the plug in the wall. So again, safety during this important stage of development is very, very important. Imitation is very important for cognitive development because if you're not able to imitate, you're no better than the parrot who just repeats without any sense of really what it means. It's been a structured phrase, it's scripted, and it doesn't mean really anything. But you've got to be able to imitate. Because we imitate when mom models it, holding it, then all mom has to do is hold it up and you're saying it. So it's progressive imitation. It's developing over time, and it is extremely important. We know symbolic play, pretend play. It tells us a lot about environments that children live in. I can remember, and I'm not sure I shared this with you before, a child in a daycare that I went to when I worked First Steps was there, and there were other children around, and they had a telephone and I think a baby or something, and they were playing. One child picked up the phone and said, 911, help, I need the police, come quickly, hurry, hurry. And it's like, whoa, that little child has maybe observed that happening in their home. Children who are able to use objects to represent other objects progress quickly in language development, more quickly in language development than children who don't think in that abstract way. I'm looking for, as part of even an assessment, and it could be an informal assessment, the child who maybe picks up the Kleenex and uses it as the blanket for the child. A Kleenex isn't a blanket, but the child is using this in pretend play, symbolic play. The child who uses the Kleenex as a hat, a wash rag. The child who maybe has a stick of some sort of a peg or something and uses it to stir or pretend play the coffee, using symbolic play. Also, we're seeing gestures, which also contribute to cognitive development. Children in substage 1 of Piaget sensory motor intelligence, the birth to 2, they're very egocentric. Life is all about them. They're not imitative. They can observe visually. They do not play. You have to tend to every need that they have. So in substage 1, egocentricity from birth to 1 month. 1 month to 4 months, they're beginning to coo. And parents are truly exhausted when they bring that baby home. They're exhausted. And so you think, oh, I can't, when will he sleep through the night? I can't do this. But when the baby begins to coo, when the baby begins to smile, these things are so reinforcing. I remember as I was nursing my daughter, and I was up in the middle of the night again, and I was changing her diaper practically with one eye closed, and I was still talking to her in a loving way, and she was just wide awake and so excited to have me up at 2 or whatever time it was, and she smiled. Oh my gosh, I probably broke down in tears. I don't remember, but it was very, very reinforcing. Now I get it. Now I get it. My baby thinks I'm okay. So substage 2 is 1 to 4 months. The baby is showing more awareness because remember, we're expecting this baby to be sitting independently around 6 or 7 months. So at 4 months, that baby's beginning to coo. They're laughing at the end of this second substage. They're still very egocentric. They can't take care of their own needs, but they are showing more awareness of objects around them. In substage 3, it's 4 to 8 months, and they're beginning to babble. Now, that's why I wanted you to watch these YouTube videos. Cooing is sort of open vowel sounds, and they may squeal, ah, ooh, and you may hear a consonant or two, but cooing is during a social interaction. Cooing happens when someone is socially interactive with that infant. Babbling is when they're beginning to use consonants with those vowels. And babbling occurs many times when the child is alone. Let's say they wake up in the morning and they're not too wet and they're just kind of in a mellow mood, and they found their favorite little bunny and they're beginning to talk to the bunny. Ba, 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 ba. Consonant vowel. Cooing vowels. Social interaction. Babbling many times is when they're by themselves. Ba, 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 ba. That is reduplicated babbling because they're repeating the same syllable. Variegated babbling would be adabaka, adabada. Variegated babbling, but they're beginning to babble. 4 to 8 months, they're beginning to sit, or they should be sitting, I would say by 8 months, independently. They're not flopping over. That's why we put those little tubes around them, because we're afraid that they'll fall. So they're beginning to babble. They're still somewhat egocentric. We still have object permanence, out of sight, out of mind, and they're beginning to engage and be more social. Substage 4, 8 to 12 months, they're remembering objects now, and they might remember where those objects are. They're not as egocentric because at 12 months we know they're beginning to walk. They can go get what they want, and they do. They're not as egocentric. They do have behaviors that are intentional. We see more imitation. They look for toys not in sight. Substage 5, 12 to 18 months. Whoa, things are really, really taking off. Causality is more sophisticated. They know this causes this. They're becoming a better problem solver. They are very, very imitative. Remember, we're approaching that 2 years. And you may hear the first word. Early signs of the first word. Dad. Something like that. They're conveying messages with their voice and face more. They're certainly more expressive. So the difference between what Piaget has said and some other researchers, and as we talked about in Nature versus Nurture, there's always somebody who says, well, I agree with most of what he says, but not everything. And in this situation with Piaget, there are researchers who found that they believe there are specific cognitive abilities that occur a little bit before Piaget says that they have emerged. And they feel that object permanence maybe is in place before 18 to 24 months that Piaget reports. Now, is it that maybe the child can't get to the item at 6 months? They see it, they know that it's covered up, they know it's there, but they can't get to it. So other researchers are saying, nah, it's before. Piaget reports it at 18 to 24 months. They're also saying that maybe cognitive development isn't a step-by-step process. It isn't quite as rigid as Piaget reported it to be. But basically, they are truly in agreement with Piaget. And you can see these children attempting to roll over, attempting to sit up, attempting to crawl. It's very observable behavior. So it's much easier to report that observable behavior. It's much more difficult to report object permanence for a 6-month-old who may or may not recognize that you just covered up their favorite toy. We know that sensory motor development or cognitive development, language development in general, is not just environmental. I think the researchers would give some credence to the genetic makeup, but there again is that dilemma, nature versus nurture. But it isn't just purely sensory motor. We know that a child who is not able to move. I worked with a girl one time, a child that had hip dysplasia, and so she'd had surgeries, and this was just a little booger because I was in First Steps, and she was in a cast, and she was pretty stationary, and so she didn't have that opportunity to explore, and so I was afraid to think too much or come to a conclusion about her cognitive development because she wasn't able to explore her environment like a typically developing child. However, this child didn't imitate. The child had a real blank look on their face, not a lot of affect. And so I had to be really careful with my assessment of where I thought this child was in terms of cognition and language because she wasn't able to develop in a typical fashion. But we do know that we get into some of that genetic information as well. I think that I will stop there and we will pick up with pre-operational thought. It's page 47 on my PowerPoint, stage 2 of Piaget's 4 stages of intellectual development. And we're going to pick up with pre-operational thought. That's the second stage. And get into some more of the finer characteristics of pre-operational thought. Okay, remember you have an assignment on Canvas, and look for those YouTube videos. Remember you have to Google YouTube video examples of cooing. Baby makes cute cooing noises. It's a compilation of videos, and babbling 7 months, babbling, and talking twin babies part 2. Also, I want you to be aware of parentese and the parentese that's taking place during these videos. Okay, this lecture was approximately 39 minutes, and I will continue probably later this week. Have a good day.